Scenes had to be censored in order to release this video on YouTube. If you want to see the uncensored version along with many other original or uncut videos of ours, check out our website armchairhistory.tv below, where you can sign up for a free month. At first light, soldiers of the British Highland Brigade begin their advance through a waterlogged field. From the enemy trench, sudden reports of rifle fire and artillery burst to life. Highlanders begin rushing forward in a desperate charge, but are cut down in swaths as bullets and shrapnel wreak havoc. Some break and run, others push on, only to be cut down before they hit the enemy trench. It is a grim scene, reminiscent of the fighting in Flanders or the Somme. But this isn't the Great War. The year is 1899, and South Africa is in flames. After the Pretoria Convention of 1881, the South African Republic emerged from its war with Britain as an independent state, or at least on paper. In practice, Britain still retained a vague authority over its external affairs. Some within the Republic wondered if they had truly won their sovereignty. Meanwhile, some within Britain thought they were too lax on the impudent Boers. As things were, the uneasy peace was held up thanks to a fragile status quo. But that balance was about to be shattered by a discovery deep in the heart of the Transvaal. In 1886, gold was discovered on the Witwatersrand Reef. Almost overnight, the impoverished republic found itself sitting atop one of the largest gold deposits in the world. A wave of prospectors and fortune seekers, collectively known as the Outlanders, flooded into the region. The sleepy town of Johannesburg exploded into a bustling mining city. For the rural Boers, it was deeply unsettling. The sudden influx of wealth and outsiders transformed the Transvaal's strategic value, once again drawing the eyes of the British Empire. The Boer government, led by the staunch but aging President Paul Kruger, viewed the Outlanders with deep suspicion. These mostly English-speaking newcomers threatened to overwhelm the Boer population and erode their culture. To curb their influence, Kruger's government denied the Outlanders political rights despite their large tax contributions. For powerful imperialists like Cecil Rhodes, the situation was an outrage, but it also provided opportunity. As Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, alongside being an influential mining magnate, Rhodes saw this crisis as a chance to extend British influence and control over the Transvaal's immense mineral wealth. Tensions boiled over in late 1895 when Rhodes orchestrated the infamous Jameson Raid. Led by Dr. Leander Starr Jameson, a force of over 500 heavily armed men from the British South Africa Company invaded the Transvaal from neighboring Bechuanaland. Their goal was to spark an uprising amongst the disgruntled Outlanders in Johannesburg and justify British intervention. The raid was a disaster. Outlanders stayed silent, and Jameson's men were quickly surrounded and forced to surrender at Doornkop on January 2, 1896. Rhodes was forced to resign as Prime Minister, as the fiasco effectively ended his career and humiliated the British government by exposing their imperial ambitions. The Boers responded with a massive arms buildup all across the Transvaal. Thanks to the Jameson Raid, Anglo-Boer relations were destroyed beyond repair. Attempts to resolve the Outlanders issue failed. It also didn't help that Alfred Milner, Britain's new High Commissioner, was a staunch imperialist like Rhodes, who saw the war as inevitable and perhaps even necessary. His negotiations with Kruger at the Bloemfontein Conference in 1899 quickly collapsed. With British troop buildups underway and diplomacy at a standstill, the Transvaal allied with their Afrikaner brethren in the Orange Free State. On October 9th, they issued an ultimatum demanding British troop withdrawals. Britain let it expire, and 2 days later, Boer forces crossed into British territory. The Second Boer War had begun. The British Army started in a difficult position. Equipment had vastly improved since the First Boer War, with soldiers having their single-shot rifles upgraded to Lee-Metford bolt-action rifles, while their distinct scarlet uniforms were swapped out with a more inconspicuous khaki service dress. However, British troop numbers in South Africa at the war's outbreak totaled only 10,600 men, with most of these being garrison troops with limited cavalry and artillery support. Due to the urgency of the situation, over 47,000 men of the British First Army Corps were being mobilized in Britain. The First Army Corps would also bring a complement of field artillery and machine guns to bolster their firepower, while an additional 10,000 men under the command of Sir George White were rushed to South Africa to quickly reinforce the garrisons. Combined, the Transvaal and Orange Free State were able to field over 50,000 men, alongside an influx of foreign volunteers who would come and go throughout the war. This force consisted largely of citizen commandos, expert horsemen and marksmen wearing their everyday earth-toned civilian clothes, which provided excellent natural camouflage, and predominantly armed with rifles, including some newer models such as the deadly accurate clip-loading Mauser rifle. Each soldier typically provided his own horse and minimal kit, meaning they were more flexible and mobile than their British counterparts. Still, the logistics of organizing an offensive between two national armies was a lengthy process, which cost them precious time. By the time Boer commandos surged into Natal and the Cape Colony, General White already had his men reinforcing key positions. The Boer strategy was similar to one they used in the First War: take the fight into British-controlled territory, confront key garrisons to tie up their forces, and encourage sympathetic Afrikaners across the Cape to rise up in rebellion. All of this had to be done before major British reinforcements, like the First Army Corps, could arrive in November. In Natal, the invasion effort was being led by Piet Joubert, a veteran of the First Boer War who had won major victories. However, he was 66 years old by this time, and even held private doubts about the war. This was made worse thanks to losses against the British at Talana Hill and Elandslaagte over October 20th to the 21st, which stunted the momentum of their offensive. A month later, Joubert himself would suffer injuries in combat that led to his death. However, even with the loss of Joubert, British reluctance to press their advantage meant that the Boers were successful in surrounding vital towns like Ladysmith, as well as Mafeking and Kimberley. British garrisons were now under siege, effectively dictating the early course of the war by forcing High Command to divert all available resources toward their relief. The full weight of the Empire's response began to arrive in early November 1899. With the First Army Corps under General Redvers Buller disembarking alongside other colonial reinforcements in South Africa. With these forces, the British began to organize their counteroffensive. However, their initial response was marked by overconfidence and, yet again, a critical underestimation of the Boers. Relief columns were dispatched to besieged positions, but British troops found themselves in unfamiliar terrain. To make matters worse, Boer asymmetrical tactics turned the British relief efforts into a series of disasters. One early setback happened near Chivoli on November 15th, when a British armored train carrying troops and reconnaissance parties was ambushed and derailed by Boer commandos and their Italian volunteers. After a fierce gunfight, the British were forced to surrender, leading to the capture of several important officers and even a young Winston Churchill who was working as a war correspondent. However, the loss at Chieveley was merely a prelude to the events that happened over a single, devastating week in December 1899, forever seared into British memory as the Black Week. The first blow fell on December 10th at Stormberg in the Cape Colony. Lieutenant General William Gadiker, eager to push back the Boers, launched an ill-prepared night march against a Boer position. Misled by inadequate guides, his exhausted troops marched in circles, arriving in the wrong place in daylight, only to be ambushed. The attack was a complete failure, resulting in over 600 British casualties, mostly captured, while Boer losses were minimal. The next day, an even greater disaster occurred at Machersfontein, south of Kimberley. British troops under Lieutenant General Paul Methuen were tasked with Kimberley's relief, but were suffering from attrition after fighting costly engagements at Belmont and the Modder River. In order to reach the town, they had to clear the Machersfontein Hill of its Boer occupants under the command of General Piet Cronje. General Methuen led a night march with his Highland Brigade, hoping to draw close to the Boer defenses on the hilltop and launch an assault at dawn. Little did he know that General Cronje had ordered his men to move their trench lines further down to the foot of the hill. They were invisible to British artillery and perfectly suited to sweep the flat approach with rifle fire. Over the night of December 11th, Methuen's Highlanders were led through pouring rain in a dense quarter column formation. By the time rain stopped at first light, Methuen ordered their commander, Major General Andrew Wauchope, to assault the hilltop. In their advance, Wauchope unknowingly led his troops into enemy sightlines. Here, General Cronje waited until the last possible moment before ordering his riflemen to unleash a devastating close-range volley. As guns and artillery erupted from the newly revealed trench lines, the Highland Brigade was thrown into chaos. General Wauchope was killed almost immediately, and the attack fell apart. Attempts by other units to salvage the situation or support the pinned Highlanders failed in the face of continuous gunfire. By the end of the day, Methuen was forced to withdraw, leaving nearly 1,000 casualties on the field. With his subordinates floundering at Stormberg and Machersfontein, 1st Corps Commander Sir Redvers Buller decided to personally lead the relief effort of Ladysmith. On December 15th, he ordered a frontal assault against Boer positions entrenched along the Tugela River. The British assault quickly disintegrated as Boer rifle and artillery fire blunted any attempt to break through to the trench lines. Before the losses could get any worse, Buller called off the attack, leaving 900 casualties among his men. Before we continue, I'd like to thank today's sponsor, Odoo, an all-in-one online business management platform designed to make life easier for entrepreneurs. Whether you're managing invoicing, accounting, inventory, or projects, Odoo's suite of applications streamlines the process so you can focus on what matters most. One of our favorite Odoo tools is the website app, which lets you build a professional website quickly, easily, and best of all, for free. Using Odoo's website configurator, you can design the structure of your site in just 4 simple steps. Then, with their drag and drop builder, you can customize everything: text, images, colors, and layout. No technical skills required. Want to add flair? Odoo includes animated effects and even an integrated AI assistant powered by ChatGPT that can generate, rephrase, or translate your content on the fly. We used it ourselves to try building a site for our upcoming strategy game, Master of Command, and the process couldn't have been smoother. To support the channel and to try it for yourself, click the link in the description to start building your Odoo-powered website for free. That includes a lifetime free app, unlimited hosting and support, and even a free custom domain for 1 year. Ladysmith remained under siege, and the Empire reeled from a third major defeat. The news of the Black Week sent shockwaves through Britain and the Empire. 3 defeats in less than a week. The fact this was inflicted by an army of citizen farmers was all the more humiliating. For many observers, it seemed as if the lessons of 1881 had not been learned. Boer mobility, their expert use of modern rifles and fieldcraft, had once again confounded the British Army. Public outcry of the military crisis meant that radical change in both leadership and approach was needed. General Buller was replaced as Commander-in-Chief by Field Marshal Frederick Roberts, a respected veteran of campaigns in India and Afghanistan. As his Chief of Staff, Roberts brought the formidable and ruthlessly efficient General Herbert Kitchener, fresh from his victory in the Sudan campaign. While Buller remained in Natal to try and relieve Ladysmith, Roberts and Lord Kitchener planned a major offensive on a new front, aiming to strike directly at the heart of the Boer republics. Roberts' strategy involved a massive concentration of forces in the west, followed by a great flanking march to relieve Kimberley, trap Cronje's army besieging it, and then advance on the Orange Free State capital of Bloemfontein. Strategically, the new commanders sought to learn from their predecessors' mistakes. Instead of relying on poorly coordinated frontal assaults, a key element of Roberts' strategy was the use of mounted troops to counter Boer mobility. Doing this also required a tighter rein over their logistics network, which Kitchener quickly set to work overhauling. More emphasis was also placed on reconnaissance, the use of cover, and flexible tactics in the field. Though the process of unlearning old doctrines and fully embracing the realities of this new warfare would be slow and uneven. The British counteroffensive began in February 1900. Roberts launched a flanking march east from the Moder River to get behind the Boers still entrenched at Machersfontein. Here, the cavalry division broke through Boer lines and relieved Kimberley on February 15th, ending its 124-day siege. Outflanked, General Cronje abandoned his defenses at Machersfontein and retreated toward Bloemfontein. British columns pursued him relentlessly until he was cornered at Paardeberg Drift. Kitchener aimed to give the Boers a taste of their own medicine by laying siege to their camp. After 10 days of heavy fighting and a costly initial assault, Cronje and some 4,000 Boers were forced to surrender on February 27, the anniversary of the British defeat at Majuba Hill. This was a much-needed victory for Britain, since it removed a large portion of the Boer fighting force from the field, while also boosting morale after months of setbacks. With Cronje defeated, the path to Bloemfontein was open. Roberts' army advanced, and after a series of smaller engagements, the capital of the Orange Free State was captured on March 13, 1900. Meanwhile, in Natal, General Buller suffered through more bloody setbacks at Spienkop and Valkrans before he finally broke through the Boer defenses on the Tugela Heights. Using his overwhelming superiority in artillery and a more methodical approach, Buller's forces relieved Ladysmith on February 28, ending a siege that had lasted 118 days. The tide of the war was turning decisively. The British had relieved the besieged towns, captured a Boer capital, and inflicted a major defeat on one of their main field armies. The next objective was the Transvaal capital, Pretoria. While Roberts regrouped his main army in Bloemfontein to replenish supplies and deal with a severe outbreak of enteric fever, smaller operations continued. The relief of Mafeking, besieged since the start of the war, and gallantly defended by Colonel Robert Baden-Powell, became a major focus of public attention. A flying column of mostly mounted troops under Colonel Brian Mann was dispatched from Kimberley to relieve Mafeking. After a hard march and several skirmishes, Mann's column linked up with a Rhodesian force from the north and broke through the Boer lines to relieve the city on May 17, 1900. With his main lines of communication somewhat secured and his army reorganized, Roberts resumed his main advance northwards from Bloemfontein in early May. The Boers were becoming increasingly outnumbered and unable to halt the methodical British advance. By May 31st, Johannesburg fell after some resistance at Doornkop, the site of Jameson's surrender years earlier. Just a few days later, on June 5th, Roberts' army marched into Pretoria, the capital of the South African Republic. Many British prisoners of war were liberated, and the Union Jack was hoisted over the old council hall. With both Boer capitals captured and their main field armies either defeated or dispersed, many in Britain believed the war was effectively over. But this was far from the truth. While some Boers did surrender, the more determined elements resolved to fight on. Deprived of their conventional military structure and unable to meet the British in set-piece battles, Boer leaders like Christian de Wet, Louis Botha, and Koos de la Rey reverted to a highly effective form of guerrilla warfare. This was a war they were uniquely suited to wage. Small mobile commando units intimately familiar with the vast and rugged terrain of the Highveld began a campaign of ambushes and raids. Isolated outposts, railway lines, and even British marching columns were hit. Utilizing their superior horsemanship and marksmanship, Boer guerrillas would strike suddenly and then melt away before significant British forces could be brought against them, finding success in the same elusive tactics that brought them success in the First Boer War. This new phase of the conflict presented a formidable challenge to the British military. Roberts, and later Kitchener, who took full command in November 1900, found their large conventional army struggling to combat an invisible enemy. The Boers were living off the land, and were often supported by a sympathetic rural population, making them incredibly difficult to pin down. In response, the British gradually adapted their own tactics. Large, cumbersome columns gave way to smaller, more mobile flying columns of mounted infantry, increasingly composed of colonial troops and newly raised imperial yeomanry who were better suited to the demands of this type of warfare. But mobility alone wasn't enough. To cut the Boers off from food and support, the British adopted harsh new policies. Farms were burned, crops destroyed, and livestock seized in a sweeping scorched earth campaign. To control Boer movement and protect rail lines, Kitchener oversaw the construction of blockhouses, which were small, fortified posts made of stone or corrugated iron and linked by barbed wire fences to create vast cages across the veld. These lines of blockhouses were manned by infantry and were designed to restrict Boer movement and funnel them into zones where British columns could trap them in coordinated drives. It was a grinding strategy meant to choke resistance by dominating the terrain and isolating fighters from their civilian support. However, these drives and scorched earth tactics soon displaced vast numbers of Boer civilians, mostly women and children, as well as black Africans living on Boer farms. To manage this growing refugee crisis and cut support for the commandos, the British military constructed a system of concentration camps. Initially, some camps were established for Boer families who voluntarily surrendered, but most detainees were forcibly removed from their homes. The camps were hastily built, poorly supplied, and soon became notorious for their terrible conditions. The resulting death toll in these concentration camps was horrific. It is estimated that approximately 28,000 Boers died primarily from disease and malnutrition. An additional toll saw an estimated 14,000 black Africans perish in separate but equally deplorable camps. By 1902, the relentless pressure of the British drives, the effectiveness of the blockhouse system, the scorched earth policy, and the severe conditions in the concentration camps had taken a terrible toll on the Boer will and ability to continue the fight. Although Boer commandos like De Wet and De la Rey continued to launch daring raids and elude capture, overall numbers were dwindling and resources were exhausted. Large swaths of the Veld were increasingly crisscrossed by British barriers, and the Boer support network among the civilian population had been decimated. The dream of a general uprising in the Cape Colony had also failed to materialize, despite some localized rebel activity. Many Boers recognized that further resistance, however heroic, could lead only to the complete ruin of their people. Recognizing the unsustainable nature of the conflict, Boer leaders began to seek avenues for peace. After initial informal contacts, formal negotiations between Boer representatives and the British authorities, including Lord Kitchener and Alfred Milner, commenced in May of 1902 at Vereeniging. The discussions were fraught. Though exhausted, the Boers were deeply reluctant to surrender their independence, which was a core demand of the British. Key figures like Christian de Wet argued passionately for continuing the struggle, but the majority of pragmatists like Louis Botha and Jan Smuts understood that a negotiated settlement was the only way to preserve what remained of their nation and prevent further suffering. After weeks of difficult negotiations, the Treaty of Vereeniging was signed on May 31, 1902, officially ending the Second Boer War. The terms were harsh, but included some concessions to the defeated Boers. The Transvaal and the Orange Free State were to surrender their independence and become colonies within the British Empire. The treaty itself also promised eventual self-government, which was granted relatively quickly in 1910 when the Union of South Africa was formed. The Dutch language would be protected in schools and courts, and financial assistance was promised by Britain for reconstruction and to help Boer farmers return to their lands. The issue of Native African enfranchisement was deferred until after self-government was granted, effectively ensuring that it would be decided by the white minority. It was a decision that would have profound and lasting consequences for the future of South Africa. The remaining Boer commandos laid down their arms, and the long, bitter conflict finally came to an end.